The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the luxurious suburban neighborhood in hues of gold and crimson. The air was still, the streets quiet, save for the occasional hum of a passing car. This was the kind of neighborhood where every lawn was meticulously trimmed, every house a near replica of the next. And every resident carried an unspoken agreement to maintain the illusion of perfection. But tonight, the serenity of this idyllic community would begin to crack. Inside one of the grand cookie-cutter homes, a man named Gerald sat slouched on his leather recliner, his face illuminated by the cold blue glow of his laptop. Gerald was the kind of man who prided himself on his old money roots, though the truth was far less glamorous. His wealth had dwindled over the years, and his disdain for the changing world around him had only grown. He believed in the sanctity of his neighborhood, a place he thought should be reserved for people like him, white, wealthy, and unquestionable in their entitlement. For months, Gerald had been leeching off his neighbor's Wi-Fi. It had been a small victory, a petty act of defiance against Rihanna, the new black woman who had moved into the house next door. He didn't know much about her, nor did he care to. To Gerald, she was an anomaly, a disruption to the status quo of their pristine community. Her presence alone was enough to unsettle him, though he would never admit it outright. Instead, he convinced himself that his disdain was rooted in something else, anything but race. As he scrolled through his usual forums, where like-minded individuals shared their grievances about the world, his internet connection suddenly dropped. Gerald frowned, refreshing the page. Nothing. He opened his Wi-Fi settings, scanning for available networks. The familiar name of Rihanna's network was still there, but now it was locked with a new password. What the hell? Gerald muttered, his frustration mounting. He tried a few combinations, but none worked. She had changed it. She had locked him out. The realization hit him like a slap to the face. How dare she? After all, hadn't he been using it without issue for months? What kind of person would go out of their way to disrupt something so harmless? The irony of his indignation was lost on him. To Gerald, this was an act of war. He slammed his laptop shut and stood, pacing the room. His mind raced with possibilities. Could she have known he was using it? Had she done this on purpose? The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. This wasn't just about the Wi-Fi anymore. This was about control, about power. And Gerald wasn't about to let her win. By the time the clock struck 9 p.m., Gerald's anger had reached a boiling point. He stormed out of his house, his fists clenched at his sides. The cool night air did little to calm him as he marched across the perfectly manicured lawn that separated their homes. He reached Rihanna's front door and pounded on it with a force that echoed through the quiet street. Inside, Rihanna was curled up on her couch, a book in hand and a cup of tea resting on the table beside her. The sudden banging startled her, and she set the book down, her heart racing. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the aggressive knock sent a chill down her spine. Taking a deep breath, she approached the door, peering through the peephole. There he was, her neighbor. His face twisted in an expression of barely contained rage. Rihanna hesitated. She had seen him around, always keeping to himself, his gaze cold and judgmental whenever their paths crossed. She had sensed his disapproval from the moment she moved in, but she had chosen to ignore it. Until now. "Can I help you?" she asked cautiously, opening the door just enough to see him, but keeping the chain locked. "You changed your Wi-Fi password," Gerald snapped, his voice dripping with accusation. Rihanna blinked, taken aback by the absurdity of his statement. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," he said, his tone growing louder. "You changed it. I've been using that connection for months, and now it's gone. Do you think you can just come into this neighborhood and start messing with things like you own the place?" Her shock quickly turned to anger. "Are you seriously standing here, admitting that you've been stealing my Wi-Fi and then blaming me for securing it?" Gerald's face flushed, but he didn't back down. It's not stealing if it's available. And people like you don't belong here anyway. You think you can just waltz into a community like this and act like you're one of us? You're not. The words hung in the air, heavy and venomous. Rihanna felt her chest tighten, a mix of anger and hurt bubbling to the surface. But she refused to let him see her falter. I don't know who you think you are, she said. Her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her, but you have no right to come to my home and speak to me like this. Now, if you don't leave, I'll call the police. Gerald's eyes narrowed. Oh. I'll call the police, he sneered. Let's see what they think about someone like you living in a place like this. Rihanna slammed the door in his face, her hands trembling as she locked it. She leaned against the door, taking deep breaths to steady herself. She had dealt with racism before, but something about Gerald's entitlement, his audacity, felt different. It wasn't just about her. It was about the unspoken rules of the world they lived in, rules that people like him clung to with every fiber of their being. Outside, Gerald stood on her porch, seething. He pulled out his phone. Dialing 911. He knew exactly what he was doing. He would paint her as the aggressor, the outsider who didn't belong. And he was confident the police would see things his way. After all, they always did. As he waited for the call to connect, a twisted sense of satisfaction washed over him. He had no doubt that this would be the beginning of the end for Rihanna. What he didn't realize, what he couldn't possibly know, was that this was also the beginning of the end for him. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows across the pristine suburban street. Gerald stood on his porch, arms crossed, his face set in a smug expression as he watched the patrol car pull up to the curb. This was it. This was his moment to reclaim control, to remind Rihanna, and everyone else, that she didn't belong here. 2 officers stepped out of the car. The older of the two, Officer Daniels, was a grizzled veteran with a stern expression. His younger partner, Officer Martinez, looked more hesitant, his eyes darting between Gerald and the immaculate homes that lined the street. Gerald waved them over, his confidence growing with each step they took toward him. Officers, he began, his voice dripping with false concern, I'm so glad you're here. I've been having trouble with my neighbor. She's been acting suspiciously, and I think she might be involved in something illegal. Daniels raised an eyebrow. Suspicious how? Well, Gerald said, lowering his voice as if to emphasize the gravity of the situation, she's been disrupting the neighborhood, causing all sorts of problems. And frankly, I don't think she belongs here. I've lived in this community for over 20 years, and I can tell when someone doesn't fit in. Martinez frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. What exactly did she do? She's aggressive, Gerald lied, his words oozing with self-righteousness. She slammed the door in my face earlier when I tried to talk to her about some issues we've been having. And I'm pretty sure she's been stealing from other neighbors. You know how it is, people like that move in, and suddenly the whole neighborhood goes downhill. Daniels exchanged a glance with Martinez, his expression unreadable. All right, he said finally. We'll talk to her. Gerald's smirk widened as he led them to Rihanna's house, his steps purposeful and triumphant. He could already picture it, Rihanna being escorted out in handcuffs. Her belongings packed up, her presence erased from the neighborhood. It was almost too easy. Inside, Rihanna sat on her couch, her hand still trembling from her earlier encounter with Gerald. She had called a friend for support, but the conversation had done little to calm her nerves. She knew how these situations often played out. She had seen the headlines, heard the stories. And now, as the knock on her door echoed through the house, her heart sank. Taking a deep breath, his smug expression unmistakable. She hesitated, her mind racing. Should she let them in? Her posture straight and her chin held high. Good evening, officers, she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Daniels began, his tone neutral. We received a call from your neighbor here. He says there's been some trouble between the two of you. Rihanna's eyes flicked to Gerald, who stood behind them with his arms crossed and a self-satisfied smirk on his face. She felt a surge of anger but forced herself to stay calm. Yes, she said, he came to my door earlier, yelling and accusing me of things I didn't do. When I asked him to leave, he threatened to call you. Daniels nodded, his expression giving nothing away. Do you mind if we come in and talk? Rihanna hesitated. She didn't want to let them in, but she also didn't want to appear uncooperative. Finally, she stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. As the officers stepped into her home, Gerald lingered in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for evidence of wrongdoing. Rihanna noticed and felt her anger flare again. I didn't invite you in, she said sharply, her gaze locking onto him. Gerald raised his hands in mock surrender. Just trying to help, he said, though his tone made it clear he was anything but. Daniels cleared his throat, drawing their attention. All right, he said, let's get to the bottom of this. Your neighbor says you've been causing trouble in the neighborhood. Is there any truth to that? Rihanna laughed, though there was no humor in it. Trouble? The only trouble I've had is him banging on my door and accusing me of things I haven't done. He admitted to stealing my Wi-Fi, and when I secured it, he came over here yelling and threatening me. Daniels turned to Gerald. Is that true? Gerald's face flushed, but he quickly recovered. That's not the point, he said, his voice rising. The point is, she's been disrupting the neighborhood. She doesn't belong here, and everyone knows it. Martinez's eyes widened slightly at the blatant racism in Gerald's words. But Daniels remained stoic. Sir, he said, his tone firm, we're not here to discuss who belongs where. We're here to address the complaint you made. And if you've been using her Wi-Fi without permission, that's theft. Gerald's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, his confidence faltering for the first time. I didn't mean it like that, he stammered. Look, she's the problem here, not me. Daniels ignored him, turning back to Rihanna. Do you have any evidence of what he's been doing? Rihanna nodded, her heart pounding. She had anticipated this question and had prepared accordingly. Yes, she said, retrieving her phone. I have security footage of him banging on my door and yelling at me. And I also have logs from my Wi-Fi system showing unauthorized access from his devices. She handed the phone to Daniels, who reviewed the footage and the logs. His expression didn't change, but Martinez's eyebrows shot up. That's pretty clear evidence, Martinez said, glancing at his partner. Daniels nodded, handing the phone back to Rihanna. Thank you, This is helpful. Gerald's face turned an alarming shade of red. This is ridiculous, he shouted. You're taking her side? She's the one who doesn't belong here. She's the one who doesn't belong here. Gerald's voice cracked as he shouted, his anger spilling over like a dam breaking. She's ruining this neighborhood. People like her. Sir, Officer Daniels interrupted sharply, his tone suddenly icy. I suggest you choose your next words very carefully. The warning hung in the air like a loaded gun, silencing Gerald for a moment. His chest heaved, his face a deep shade of crimson as he struggled to contain himself. But the hatred in his eyes was unmistakable, and Rihanna could feel it burning into her skin like a brand. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the soft hum of the air conditioner. Then Rihanna spoke, her voice steady but laced with quiet fury. I've lived here for 6 months. I've paid my bills, maintained my property, and kept to myself. The only disruption in this neighborhood has been him. Daniels nodded, his expression unreadable. We'll need to document everything, he said, turning to Martinez. Take her statement and get the footage and logs on record. Martinez nodded, pulling out a notepad. As he began asking Rihanna questions, Daniels turned back to Gerald, his gaze hard. "Sir, we're going to need to have a word outside." Gerald hesitated, his bravado faltering. "Why? I haven't done anything wrong." "That's not what the evidence suggests," Daniels said coolly. "Let's go." Grumbling under his breath, Gerald followed Daniels out onto the porch. The cold night air did little to soothe his simmering rage. He turned to Daniels, his voice low and venomous. "You don't understand. People like her, they don't belong here. This is a respectable neighborhood. We have standards." Daniels stared at him for a long moment, his jaw tightening. "Sir," he said finally, his voice like steel. "You've just admitted to using her Wi-Fi without permission. That's a crime. And your behavior tonight, harassment, trespassing. And now these comments suggests a pattern of misconduct that we can't ignore." Gerald's mouth dropped open. "You're taking her side? You're supposed to be protecting us. People like her. Enough." Daniel snapped, his voice cutting through the night like a whip. "This isn't about her race, her background, or your personal opinions. This is about your actions. And right now, your actions are painting a very clear picture." Gerald's confidence crumbled, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the situation began to sink in. But even as fear crept into his eyes, the hatred remained, a festering wound that refused to heal. Inside the house, as Martinez finished taking Rihanna's statement, she felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was fading, leaving behind a heavy weariness. She watched as Martinez carefully documented everything, his demeanor professional but kind. "Thank you for being cooperative," he said as he wrapped up. "We'll make sure this gets handled properly." Rihanna nodded, forcing a small smile. "I just want to live in peace," she said softly. "That's all I've ever wanted." Martinez offered her a reassuring nod before stepping outside to join Daniels and Gerald. Rihanna closed the door behind him, leaning against it as she took a deep breath. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. The fear, the anger, the frustration, it all came crashing down, threatening to overwhelm her. But she wouldn't let it. She couldn't. Not yet. Outside, Daniels and Martinez stood with Gerald on the sidewalk, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Gerald's bluster had all but disappeared, replaced by a sullen silence as Daniels laid out the next steps. "We'll be filing a report," Daniels said firmly. "And I suggest you think very carefully about your actions moving forward. If you continue to harass your neighbor, there will be consequences." Gerald glared at him, his lips pressed into a thin line. But he didn't argue. He knew he was cornered, at least for now. As the officers returned to their car, Gerald stood alone on the sidewalk, his fists clenched at his sides. The humiliation burned in his chest like a fire, fueling his hatred. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The unraveling begins. What Gerald didn't know was that the police weren't done with him. As Daniels and Martinez reviewed the evidence back at the station, they began to uncover a trail of breadcrumbs that led straight to Gerald's darkest secrets. The Wi-Fi logs Rihanna had provided showed more than just unauthorized access. They revealed that Gerald had been visiting sites linked to hate groups and illegal activities. Curious, Daniels dug deeper, using the information to obtain a warrant for Gerald's online activity. What they found was shocking. Gerald wasn't just a disgruntled neighbor. He was the administrator of an online forum dedicated to spreading racist propaganda and organizing harassment campaigns. His posts were filled with venom, targeting people of color, immigrants, and anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of acceptable. And it didn't stop there. The sites he frequented were linked to illegal activities, including cyberstalking and data breaches. The evidence was damning. And as Daniels and Martinez pieced it together, they realized they had stumbled upon something much bigger than a neighborhood dispute. The calm before the storm. The next morning, Gerald woke to the sound of his doorbell ringing. Groggy and irritable, he stumbled to the door, only to find a group of officers standing on his porch, their expressions grim. "Gerald Thompson," Daniel said, holding up a warrant. "We have a warrant to search your property and seize your electronic devices." Gerald's face went pale. "What? This is ridiculous. You can't do this." "We can," Daniel said coolly. "And we will." As the officers pushed past him, Gerald's world began to crumble. He watched helplessly as they confiscated his laptop, his phone, and even his desktop computer. The smug confidence that had carried him through the night before was gone, replaced by a growing sense of dread. This wasn't just about Rihanna anymore. This was about him. His actions. His choices. And for the first time, he realized just how much he had to lose. The morning Gerald's house was raided by police, the neighborhood awakened to an unusual sight. Officers swarmed his pristine lawn, carrying out computers, hard drives, and filing boxes. The once untouchable Gerald Thompson, the self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood's standards, stood on his porch, pale and trembling. As his world unraveled, word spread quickly. Curtains twitched, whispers traveled from house to house, and phones buzzed with texts between neighbors. Gerald had always been a polarizing figure. Some admired his outspoken nature, while others found his arrogance insufferable. But no one could have predicted this. From her window, Rihanna watched the scene unfold with a mix of relief and apprehension. She hadn't expected things to escalate this far. After the police had taken her statement, she thought it would end with a warning or, at most, a fine for Gerald's harassment. But now, seeing the officers haul out his possessions, she realized there was more to him than she had imagined. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from her best friend, Marissa. "Marissa, girl, did you see the cops at Gerald's house? What's going on?" "Eyes." Rihanna hesitated before replying. "Rihanna, yeah, I saw. No idea what they're looking for, though. Probably karma catching up to him." Marissa's response came almost immediately. "Marissa, about time. That man's been a nightmare since you moved in. Keep me posted." Rihanna chuckled despite herself, but the tension in her chest remained. She knew better than to celebrate too soon. People like Gerald didn't go down without a fight. At the police station, Daniels and Martinez reviewed the contents of Gerald's confiscated devices. What they uncovered was worse than they had anticipated. Gerald's laptop was a treasure trove of incriminating material, hate-filled manifestos, detailed plans for online harassment campaigns, and even private information about his neighbors, including Rihanna. "Look at this," Daniels said, pointing to a folder labeled Targets. Inside were files on several individuals in the neighborhood, complete with photos, addresses, and notes. Rihanna's file was the most detailed, filled with baseless accusations and thinly veiled threats. Martinez shook his head, disgusted. "This guy's been stalking her. He even has screenshots of her social media posts." Daniels leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "This isn't just harassment. This is obsession." But it didn't stop there. Buried deep within Gerald's files were links to forums and chat rooms where he had been coordinating with others like him. The conversations were vile, filled with racial slurs and plans to intimidate people of color who had moved into predominantly white neighborhoods. The group even had a name, the Preservation Front. "This is a hate group," Martinez said, his voice tight with anger. "And Gerald's one of their leaders." Daniels nodded, his jaw clenched. "We need to bring this to the DA. This goes way beyond a neighborhood dispute." As news of Gerald's arrest spread, the neighborhood was thrown into chaos. Some residents were shocked, unable to reconcile the man they had known with the monster revealed by the investigation. Others weren't surprised at all. "I always thought there was something off about him," said Mrs. Klein, the elderly woman who lived across the street. "He was always so intense about keeping the neighborhood pure. I just didn't realize what he meant by that. But not everyone was ready to condemn Gerald. A small group of neighbors, mostly older and wealthier, rallied around him, claiming he was the victim of a witch hunt. "This is a disgrace," said Mr. Peterson, one of Gerald's closest allies. "Gerald's done more for this neighborhood than anyone else. He's being punished for speaking the truth." Rihanna couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration as she overheard these conversations. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, there were still people defending him. It was a stark reminder of how deep-rooted prejudice could be. A few days after the raid, Rihanna was taking out her trash when she saw Gerald for the first time since his arrest. He was standing on his porch, glaring at her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. His once pristine appearance was disheveled, his confidence replaced by a simmering rage. "You think you've won," he called out, his voice low and venomous. "This isn't over." Rihanna froze, her heart pounding. She wanted to respond, to tell him he had brought this on himself, but she knew better. Engaging with him would only give him more power. Instead, she turned and walked back inside, locking the door behind her. That night, she installed additional security cameras around her property. She wasn't taking any chances. The case against Gerald moved quickly. The evidence was overwhelming, and the DA was eager to make an example of him. As the trial began, the media descended on the small suburban neighborhood, turning it into a battleground of opinions. In court, Gerald's lawyer tried to paint him as a misunderstood man who had been pushed too far by the changing demographics of his community. He was simply trying to protect his home, the lawyer argued. "He's not a racist. He's a patriot." But the prosecution dismantled this narrative with cold, hard facts. They presented the files from Gerald's computer, the hateful messages he had sent, and the plans he had made to intimidate his neighbors. They also called Rihanna to the stand, where she recounted her experiences with him in heartbreaking detail. "I moved here to build a life for myself," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "But from the moment I arrived, he made it clear that I wasn't welcome. He harassed me, stalked me, and tried to make me feel unsafe in my own home. No one should have to live like that." Her testimony was a turning point. The jury deliberated for less than a day before finding Gerald guilty on multiple charges, including harassment, cyberstalking, and hate crimes. The day Gerald was sentenced, the neighborhood felt different. The air seemed lighter, the streets quieter. For the first time in months, Rihanna felt a sense of peace. But she knew the fight wasn't over. Gerald might be gone, but the prejudice he represented still lingered, both in the neighborhood and beyond. Still, she was determined to stand her ground. She had faced the worst and come out stronger. As she sat on her porch that evening, watching the sunset, she allowed herself a small smile. This was her home now, and no one could take that away from her. The weeks following Gerald's sentencing brought a strange calm to the neighborhood. The once frequent whispers and sidelong glances directed at Rihanna began to fade, replaced by tentative smiles and polite greetings. It wasn't perfect, healing never was, but it was a start. Rihanna noticed the small changes. Mrs. Klein from across the street dropped off a basket of freshly baked cookies one afternoon, her hands trembling as she apologized for not speaking up sooner. The Johnsons, a young couple who had always been friendly but distant, invited Rihanna over for a barbecue, their way of extending an olive branch. Even the local HOA, which Gerald had once dominated with an iron fist, reached out to her, asking if she'd be interested in joining their meetings. At first, Rihanna hesitated. Forgiveness wasn't easy, and trust even harder. But she realized that these gestures, however small, were steps toward something better. And if she wanted real change, she couldn't do it alone. A month after Gerald's sentencing, the HOA held its first meeting without him. Rihanna decided to attend, curious to see how things would unfold. The community center was packed, the air buzzing with a mix of anticipation and unease. Gerald's absence was palpable, his once dominant presence replaced by a sense of opportunity. The new HOA president, a middle-aged woman named Linda, opened the meeting with a speech about moving forward. "What happened in our neighborhood was a wake-up call," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "We allowed one person's hatred to fester, and we didn't do enough to stop it. But we have a chance to do better. To be better." The room erupted into applause, and for the first time, Rihanna felt a glimmer of hope. When Linda invited her to speak, she hesitated for only a moment before standing. "Change isn't easy," Rihanna began, her voice clear and strong. "It takes effort. And it takes courage. But I believe this neighborhood can be a place where everyone feels safe and welcome. I'm willing to do my part, if you are too." The applause was louder this time. And as Rihanna looked around the room, she saw faces filled with something she hadn't expected: respect. One rainy afternoon, a letter arrived in Rihanna's mailbox. The return address was from the state penitentiary. Her hands trembled as she opened it, unsure of what to expect. The letter was short, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Rihanna, I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not even sure I deserve it. But sitting in this cell has forced me to face the truth about myself. I was wrong. About you, about everything. I let my hatred blind me, and it cost me everything. I don't know if I can ever make it right, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. Truly." Rihanna stared at the letter for a long time. Her emotions a storm of anger, sadness, and something she couldn't quite name. Forgiveness wasn't something she could give easily, especially not to someone who had caused her so much pain. But perhaps, she thought, this was a step in the right direction for both of them. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. She wasn't ready to forgive Gerald. But she was ready to move forward. And that was enough. Over the next year, the neighborhood began to transform. The HOA implemented new initiatives to foster inclusivity. From community potlucks to cultural awareness workshops. Rihanna became an active member, her voice a vital part of the discussions. New families moved in, bringing with them diverse backgrounds and fresh perspectives. The neighborhood, once a symbol of exclusivity, became a vibrant tapestry of cultures and stories. And while not everyone embraced the change, the majority did, proving that progress was possible, even in the most unlikely places. One evening, as Rihanna sat on her porch with a cup of tea, she watched the neighborhood kids play tag on the lawn. Their laughter filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension that had once gripped the community. She thought about how far things had come. About the battles she had fought and the strength she had found within herself. This was her home now. Not because she had fought for it, but because she had earned it. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the street in a warm, golden glow, Rihanna allowed herself to finally feel at peace.